I found this book, a book of her own, must reads for women. Um, that has all these famous writers that write about women, women's rights. So it starts from ancient times, um, all the way to, wow, it's a lot. We've got here so many writers, feminist writers, all the way from, you have here Doris Lessing and many others, Naomi Wolf, um, The Bitch in the House. Oh, that's interesting. So I thought we could start in the middle point, which is Virginia Woolf. Shall we? Because this book is actually, I think it gives you, like, you don't have to. Scarlet Letter was also fascinating, but let's start with Virginia Woolf, shall we? But I didn't plan it, so we have to see all the other ones. Like, there's so many books you have to read, and it's really good that they summed up this book so you don't have to read it. Because who has time, really? Unless it's like you really have to read the book. There's so many books you have to read, and this sums it up in a few pages. So, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. Woolf's powerful declaration of women's independence, autonomy, and artistry, A Room of One's Own, is widely regarded as the first great achievement of feminist literary criticism that raised and helped to shape the central issues of the modern women's movement. As one of the groundbreaking literary modernists of the 20th century, Virginia Woolf redefined the art of the novel, taking it from surface realism of external details to the deeper reaches of consciousness and the interior life. As an essayist and critic, Woolf demonstrated that a woman could formulate a new cultural understanding appropriate for dealing with the often neglected and misunderstood female perspective and the role women writers ought to play in creative life. To capture the essence of Woolf's view on women, gender, conflict, literary and cultural history, and the ways and means of creative criticism, A Room of One's Own is the foundation text. Like Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, works that remain powerful, compelling, and relevant, which I had not read, sadly, but I've heard of them. Virginia Woolf was born in London in 1882, the third child of the family of 2 boys and 2 girls. She was the daughter of a renowned Victorian critic, biographer, and scholar, Sir Leslie Stephen, the author of The History of English Thought in the 18th Century and the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. Her mother, Julia, was a famous beauty and hostess of a distinguished literary circle that gathered at the Stephens home. She died when Virginia was 13, and the loss contributed to the first of several emotional breakdowns that would recur throughout Woolf's life, sadly. In 1904, her father's death resulted in a second breakdown and a suicide attempt. When Virginia recovered, she moved with her brother and sister to a home of their own in unfashionable, at that time, Bloomsbury. There they formed the center of an eccentric and talented circle of artists, critics, and writers, including Lytton Strachey, Vitas Sackville West, E.M. Forrester, and John Maynard Keynes, all of whom would become collectively famous as the Bloomsbury Group. In 1912, Virginia married Leonard Woolf. He's Jewish, actually. Sorry, I have to mention it. I'm always mentioning the Jewish point of view. A critic and political writer. The following year, she completed her first novel, The Voyage Out, which she had been working on for 6 years. and which was published in 1915. Her second novel, Night and Day, appeared in 1919. Both stories that became Monday or Tuesday, Woolf began to experiment with a more daring experimental form to render a character's stream of consciousness an interior world of private thoughts and feelings. Her next novels, Jacob's Room, 1922, Mrs. Dalloway, 1925, and her masterpiece, To the Lighthouse, 1927, are all written in Woolf's experimental style in which conventional plot is replaced by an emphasis on the inner psychological states of her characters, and time and space reflect a deeply subjective poetic vision. It's really hard to read them because of that. Woolf's later writing includes Orlando, 1928. I recommend listening to the audiobook. It's a mock biography of a character from Elizabethan times to the present, in which the protagonist changes sexes to fit each age. Flush, I really should have read that, 1933, is a biographical fantasy of the Brownings, seen from the perspective of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog. A biography of the art that I really need to read. I actually wrote a paper when I was in junior high about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's famous for writing How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. And her husband was also a poet. So she wrote it from the perspective of a dog. I really should have read this. And she wrote a book about Roger Fry in 1940, and the novels The Waves, 1931, made into a spectacular film with the music of Philip Glass. I love that film so much. And The Years, 1937. And Between the Acts, 1941. During the 20s and the 30s, Woolf also wrote several volumes of criticism, including A Room of One's Own, 1929, and Three Guineas, 1938, in which she expanded on her critique of artistic achievement and mounted a spirited campaign on behalf of women writers. In 1941, depressed over the outbreak of war and sensing the onset of another breakdown, Virginia Woolf drowned herself. Oh gosh. Throughout a distinguished career as a novelist and critic, Virginia argued that the Victorian world that she was born into was obsolete, and that its patriarchal assumptions about the constricted roles women are assigned must be challenged by fresh ideas and new perspectives. None of her works better demonstrates this point than A Room of One's Own. Originally entitled Women in Fiction, A Room of One's Own grew out of two talks Woolf delivered at Cambridge University in October 1928, one at Newnham College, the second at the all-women's Girton College, then the only college for women at Cambridge, before an audience in Woolf's words of starved but valiant young women, intelligent, eager, poor, and destined to become schoolmistresses in Charles. Oh God, that's what I am. Woolf would later state that her motivation for her talk there was to encourage that young women, they seemed to get fearfully depressed, mainly an argument for the financial independence and privacy necessary for female artistic achievement, backed up by consideration of such women novelists as Jane Austen, the Brontes, I love them, and George Eliot, loved her too. The talks would be expanded in 1929 into A Room of One's Own. Woolf would add a fictional framework and scenes that contrast the lot of men and women at Cambridge and Oxford. She would imagine the fate of Shakespeare's sister and assert her conception of the androgynous state of mind, which she considered essential for the creation of great literature. Published by Hogarth Press, the publishing firm Woolf ran with her husband, the essay in which Woolf felt she would be attacked for a feminist and hinted at for a Sapphist is described on the dust jacket likely composed by its author as follows. This essay, which is largely fictitious, is based on the visit of an outsider to a university and expresses the thoughts suggested by a comparison between the different standards of luxury at a man's college and at a woman's. This leads this leads to a sketch of women's circumstances in the past and the effect of those circumstances upon their writing. The conditions that are favorable to imaginative work are discussed, including the right relation of the sexes. Finally, an attempt is made to outline the present state of affairs and to forecast what effect comparative freedom and independence will have upon women's artistic work in the future. When A Room of One's Own appeared in 1929, the fight to secure women's suffrage in both Britain and America. Wow, it's a lot to read. Which dominated women's rights activists for the previous 75 years, had been finally won. Despite enfranchisement, women, in Woolf's view, continued to be shut out of significant cultural institutions and suffered from various economic constraints that have prevented them from achieving their potential. Very true. Woolf's essay suggested that an entrenched patriarchal system impeded and silenced a distinctive female voice and perspective. In the essay, maybe if I had read it, I wouldn't have married. Woolf assesses the impact of this system to the man I married on female literary expression, providing the first conceptualization of literary history with gender as the key determinant. It is, in the words of critic Ellen Bayuk Rosenman, also the first concentrated attempt to create a counter-theory to Victorian sex roles, challenging the accepted notion of women's inferiority, dependency, and marginality. The essay begins by responding to an unheard question, but you may not. You may say, we ask you to speak about women in fiction. What has that got to do with A Room of One's Own? Woolf's thesis is that artistic genius and the ability of women to write great fiction requires freedom. A woman must have money, that's for sure, and a room of one's own if she is to write fiction. Living in a male-dominated world, lacking autonomy and economic independence, women are without the essential prerequisites to create important fiction. Women, according to Woolf, must be able to think, invent, imagine, and create as freely as men do, and with as little fear or ridicule and condescension. In Woolf's famous formulation, 500 pounds a year and a room of one's own make genius possible for women. With them, food, house, and clothing are mine forever. Therefore, not merely do effort and labor cease, but also hatred and bitterness. I need not hate any man. He cannot hurt me. I need not flatter any man. He has nothing to give me. I love that line. She married well. To explore the difference between this ideal and present and past reality, Woolf contrasts the possibilities and prospects faced by men and women at Oxford and Cambridge, Britain's training ground for society's movers and shakers. The woman visitor Woolf imagines is shooed off the grass, which is reserved for the male fellows and scholars of the college. Likewise, she is barred from a college's library without a male companion or sponsorship. The luncheon she receives from the all-male college is lavish and liberating, while her dinner at the all-women college is meager and demoralizing. Symbolically, men are shown wielding significant power, controlling the means of education and culture, while women are pushed to the margins, absolutely, excluded and circumscribed. The contrast leaves the narrator with two linked questions. Why are women so poor, and why have so few women written anything to rival male authors? And that's the same writer, the same question. But there's so many great writers since then. To answer the first question, Woolf shifts the scene to the British Library reading room, where research leads her to conclude that women's impoverishment has been caused chiefly by their childbearing and child-raising responsibilities, which have impeded economic independence and caused dependency on males. That's true. The second question concerning the paucity of women's literary achievement is also connected with women's impoverishment and their historical limited access to wider experience, the lack of a tradition of women's artistry to draw upon, and the cultural constraints that have silenced women's voices and obliterated their history. To make her point, Woolf surmises the likely biography of an imagined sister of Shakespeare who shares her brother's genius. Frustrated at every turn by gender constraints, Judith Shakespeare ends in suicide and obscurity. Oh, how horrible. With her potential crushed by lack of education, privacy, expectation, and freedom. To further her point, Woolf surveys literary history from a perspective that focuses on the deviation from the established gender norm and the achievement of Jane Austen, the Brontes, and George Eliot, none of whom had children, but all of whom were constrained by social pressure that limited their experiences, autonomy, and possibilities. In contrast to the fate of Judith Shakespeare and her sisters, a contemporary woman writer, one with £500 a year and a room of one's own, has, in Woolf's view, the potential for genius to flourish as never before. Freed from a battle of the sexes that dependency ensures, the liberated and autonomous woman writer may achieve an androgynous perspective that ultimately is required for literary greatness. In Woolf's view, if we face the fact, Woolf concludes, that there is no arm to cling to, but that we go alone, and that our relation is to the world of reality, and not only to the world of men and women, then the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on that body which he has so often laid down. War of One's Own remains a remarkable and provocative articulation of gender issues that resists the easy self-pity of victimhood based on male oppression. Instead, it challenges women to achieve their full potential. The issues Woolf raises regarding the constraints women face in a patriarchal society and the relation between sexual identity, literary expression, and achievement remain vital questions with which women continue to wrestle. That's so true. I wonder why, with my education, I sort of fell into a marriage. Well, I fell into a profession of teaching. To be honest, being a schoolmistress, I don't think it's so bad. I think it gives me normality. Because when you deal with kids, you sort of, it's kids can be healthy. I know this sounds crazy because I had a difficult week, but kids, where's the cat? Kids can actually encourage you to be healthy, to be real. They're young enough and real enough and not vicious. And cats are also very important, or a dog. Mostly cats. To have a cat who's there to keep you company, to encourage you, and to heal you from all that's difficult in life, all that causes you anxiety. I think Virginia Woolf was a genius, but he would have been, well, this is paraphrasing Donald Trump's statement that he prefers living heroes. I would have preferred her to be a living genius and not to have ended her life. It's so sad that so many intelligent, creative people have this destructive side, but sometimes I wonder, really, what is the role of mental illness to creativity, and can one avoid mental illness when being creative? Do you have to be mentally ill in order to be creative? I don't know. I don't think so. There's so many great writers since then, but definitely one must read Bronte's sisters. I think I ever finished a novel of theirs. George Eliot, I read short pieces, and I visited her house in Paris, which is the Museum of Romantic Life. I have visited Bloomsbury. It's completely different now. London is completely different, just like Tel Aviv is completely different. There's not these artists and writers circles, at least not where I can find them. And it's kind of sad that life has changed and we're moving forward. So it's really good we have this. So I will try to do a reading every now and then because this is really great. It's a great book I found, and a bookshelf of our own. Hopefully, it will also encourage you to read some of these. You don't have to read all of them, but it's definitely a very good idea to read a book, Room of One's Own. It's funny that I knew about Virginia Woolf. I knew about this book. I was in the center of feminism in Boston. I listened to a lecture of a top feminist, and I still stepped into the trap of marriage and children. I love my children, sorry. Children, if it sounds like I regret it, I do not regret having children, but I really wish I would have married somebody more like Virginia Woolf's husband. Somebody who could have supported my creative endeavors, which seemed like it could have been in theory, but wasn't practically, because he expected me to support him because he was patriarchal. His mindset was like that. So maybe I should have listened to Grandma and married a Jewish husband, but it's not about being Jewish or not. It's about whether a man supports a woman's right to achieve, to create peace and love, and have a wonderful weekend, and do a lot of reading because the screen is not good for you. Bye. Thank you for watching. If I get enough confidence, I might even show myself reading. Thank you. And let's see what's going to be the next one. Peace, light, and love.